Hello and welcome back to the Bird's Eye View podcast. We are here late on Tuesday night or very early on Wednesday morning, depending on where you are, because the Toronto Blue Jays, they did some stuff. There was a lot of stuff today about the Toronto Blue Jays. I'm your host, Zach Worden, joined always by Jori Negin-Shecter. And Jori, how are we feeling? Because Andres Gimenez is a Toronto Blue Jay. Yimi Garcia is a Toronto Blue Jay. Once again, Nick Sandlin is a Toronto Blue Jay. Spencer Horwitz is not. Nick Mitchell is not. Ethan Holiday is not. A lot of developments today.
Yes, I have many such thoughts, and so many thoughts that we felt the need to pull together a bird's eye view after dark because the Blue Jays got busy doing stuff. So we got to get busy doing stuff after dark. Uh, but yes, quite the day in Blue Jays land. I mean, we're obviously going to get into all of it over the next however long, but the big one is wow. A lot of stuff happened.
They did it again. They really did it again. Andres Gimenez, I mean, I think we can start there because that is the big news of the day. They trade Spencer Horwitz and Nick Mitchell to Cleveland for Gimenez and Nick Sandlin. Obviously, Gimenez comes in as probably the best infield defender in baseball. Obviously, he plays second base, so it's not, apples to apples there with some of the better shortstops in the league, but the best defensive second baseman in baseball, hands down. And the bat leaves a little bit to be desired. A little not quite the thump isn't quite there, but he was an all-star a couple years ago, had a 141 WRC plus, was a 6-win player by Fangraphs. I think he was like a 8 or 9 win player by Baseball Reference. And yeah, so I mean, obviously that's the player that you kind of hope you're getting, but at the very least you are getting an elite defender who is accrued to I think it's the 26th most F WAR in baseball since 2022, basically on the strength of his defense and base running alone.
I wish we had been doing the Bird's Eye View podcast in 2022 when the Dalton Varsho trade happened, because I feel like we probably could have just re-released the Dalton Varsho episode and just dubbed in Andres Gimenez over the Dalton Varsho commentary. He is infielder Dalton Varsho. This guy really fits exactly what this front office likes in a ball player, which whether or not that is necessarily what they should be out there seeking, that's a different discussion perhaps. But again, you know, everyone's clamoring for the Blue Jays to add power, and Ross Atkins in his early offseason avail basically goes, that's kind of low hanging fruit. That's not necessarily what we're going to go for. And everyone scoffs and everyone's like, he's got to be joking, right? And lo and behold, the Blue Jays maybe only major acquisition of the offseason ends up being a defense first infielder. They got a million infielders already, and they're going out and adding, albeit a really talented defensive one, but a light hitting defense first expensive player in Andres Gimenez.
Yes, he is entering the third season of a 7-year, $106.5 million extension that he signed a few years ago. That deal does get increasingly expensive. In 2027, it becomes a $23 million per year salary, which is, quite a lot for a guy who's not really bringing much with the bat. But, one thing that we've kind of heard in the fallout of this trade is like that there's room for a bounce back offensively, or that there's an area that the Blue Jays think that he can be something more than he's been with the bat. And obviously Ross Atkins, convenient timing for him to kind of have a media avail right after this trade goes down. But I mean, for you, I know obviously both of us have kind of spent a lot of time poring over a couple pages here. I want to know, like, what do you see, or do you see an area where Andres Gimenez can be better with the bat?
I mean, listen, I haven't poured over the video, and I'm sure that the Blue Jays have in a much more meaningful capacity. But by every offensive metric, this guy is a light hitting, even to a certain degree, doesn't get on base very much, doesn't walk a lot. I mean, his big breakout season is in 2022. I believe he had like a 350 BABIP hasn't cracked 300 since then. And of course, BABIP is almost a rudimentary stat at this point, given all the information we have with StatCast. But again, this is a situation where the guy had an outlier season, just as Dalton Varsho did. And instead of buying high like they did with Dalton Varsho, they seem to be buying a little bit lower, perhaps, with Gimenez, although it still costs a pretty penny in Spencer Horwitz, who himself, I don't know how much value he has. I mean, he just got flipped to the Pirates a couple of hours ago from the Guardians. So, you know, if he has exceptional value, I don't know if that is necessarily what showed today. But again, he probably was their best trade piece at the very least.
Yeah, it raises a ton of questions too. I mean, like, what does Will Wagner do going forward? Where does Aurelvis Martinez fit? What does Davis Schneider's future look like? They still have Josh Kasevich in the minors, and it's really interesting to see. I mean, obviously, he's such a good defender at second base. You kind of wonder if this is them planning for a future beyond Bo Bichette and trying to get somebody up the middle that is very solid defender that you can kind of move over and have him help your team that way. But I mean, it's been a conversation in Cleveland too, right? Like Cleveland doesn't, after Francisco Lindor, like they haven't had, a solid shortstop situation really. Ahmed Rosario was never all that great of a defender, so why has he not slid over? I think he played shortstop for Venezuela at the World Baseball Classic, which is interesting because obviously, like there's the tools to do it, there's the ability. I just wonder kind of, and maybe we'll find this out as time goes on, like why Cleveland never made that move or he never accepted that move or anything like that.
Yeah, that's the big thing. You mentioned the Bichette stuff. It feels a lot like a contingency plan. I mean, everything we've heard has been that Bo Bichette is headed to free agency. And it's hard to imagine a universe where the two sides are able to bridge the gap because, again, I imagine that if there's a struggle with Vlad Guerrero Jr. and his inconsistency, I mean, Bo Bichette's another story given the season that he just had last year. So I guess for me, it's maybe you're looking at Gimenez slides over to short, and that clears out that second base logjam because we were talking about it when we were doing the building ideal offseason stuff. The Blue Jays have so many second basemen, and they've traded one of them away in Spencer Horwitz, but on the net they're right back with the same number. You still got, as you mentioned, Will Wagner. You still got Davis Schneider in the mix. You still got Aurelvis Martinez in the mix. You still got Will Wagner in the mix. You have all of these guys that you need to find a home for. And the Gimenez edition, while clearly making him the number one guy there, because realistically it was kind of jump ball for second base. Instead of jump ball for second base, it's now about a million guys that are still maybe on the team, maybe not on the team, and a lot of guys that aren't going to play elsewhere on the infield.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I kind of wanted to go back to his offensive profile because I do have his Savant page up, and I mean, you know what, this is a guy who, it's kind of the Luis Arias playbook, like without the solid direction of contact, right? Where it's he doesn't walk, he chases a ton, he doesn't really strike out, but he just, he doesn't hit the ball hard, he doesn't barrel it, he doesn't hit it off the sweet spot. His bat speed is in the seventh percentile. Um, like I don't know if the Blue Jays have done a pretty good job of like finding guys who can be like a little bit of sweet spot merchants in Ernie Clement, Will Wagner's kind of that way. Spencer Horwitz was a guy like that, right? Where these guys don't have the extreme batted ball data, but they are able to get a little bit more out of their profiles because they do hit the ball on at an optimal direction and kind of find a way to pick up hits that way. So maybe they do see something in the swing that they like that they can tinker with and maybe find something more out of his bat
I
that way.
I
But I
just
mean,
I just struggle because it's not like they're grabbing him from the Colorado Rockies. They're grabbing him from one of the preeminent analytical teams in all of baseball in the Cleveland Guardians. And sure, maybe they're a bit more of a pitching lab than a hitting lab, but I mean, I have a hard time believing that the Blue Jays are smarter than the Cleveland Guardians. I just don't.
I mean, I think it's trying to talk yourself into something. Like the offensive profile is ugly.
It's bad. It's not,
There's
and
no,
and I don't hate the trade either because I think that you've turned Spencer Horwitz into a valuable piece, but I think that the frightening implication is that the flexibility basically gets swallowed up in one fell swoop. And you can't, the same way you couldn't build a trade deadline around Jordan Hicks a couple of years back, you can't build an offseason around Andres Gimenez. You just can't.
yeah. I think it's one of those things where the 2022 where he was an all-star and 141 WRC plus. Like, I mean, I feel like you can look at that season, right? Like his WOBA that year was 364 and his ex WOBA was 326.
Yeah,
Like
even
the
during
signs are
that
there,
season,
right?
I remember that the discussion by and large was that this is a one-off. This is not sustainable, and lo and behold, it wasn't.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that Cleveland gave him that extension after that season, though.
Well, I think it's just the defense, right? There was so much, and again, the Blue Jays obviously value the defense, and for them, they probably didn't see him turning into an 80 WRC plus guy from those heights of a 140 WRC plus.
I mean, they're probably sitting there doing the same thing that Blue Jays fans do with Dalton Varsho, right? Like if he's a league average bat, he's a 5-6 win player
Exactly.
because he's
Even
so
this
good
year, he
defensively.
was a 5 win or he was a 4 win player by B War, I believe. Obviously, F4 wasn't quite as kind to him, but the point stands that he basically just needs to be a league average bat to be extremely valuable. And we've had the exact same conversation regarding Dalton Varsho. The problem is that the Blue Jays have had no issues with defense. They just won back-to-back team gold gloves.
Yeah, this might be like the most disgusting sentence that I say on the podcast today,
Oh no.
but they
It's
were
Blue Jays after dark, It's okay. It's got that R rating for a reason.
they were middle of the pack in the league as second base defenders last year. I believe they were 12th in DRS. They were 13th or 14th in outs above average and like 14th in D defensive WAR at second base
Don't
last
say
year.
it. Don't, I know where you're going with this. Don't even.
So like it's funny to me because we always do this where we talk before we get on the podcast and we have conversations before we get on, and then our stances like flip when we start talking through it. Because I feel like, in our chat, I was kind of like, I like kind of don't like this, and you're like, it's fine, like whatever. But now I feel like we're kind of on the opposite sides.
I don't
But
know. I'm listen, like I said, I was pro Andres Gimenez trade until Shai Davidi and Ben Nicholson Smith basically said, this is it. Like, don't expect anything else. And, there was some floating around of names like Jock Peterson. And I think Anthony Santander did get mentioned, but it was kind of like, well, if they get that, they're not going to be getting a pitcher. And if they get the pitcher, then they're not going to be getting that. And they don't desperately need a pitcher per se. I mean, they have a decent bit of depth in the minor leagues, following obviously the deadline. Jake Bloss is the big name, of course, but they need to add across the board and they need to add substantially across the board. So obviously I prefer they focused on, on a stick, but Corbin Burns would be a mighty fine player to add to this team and would jumpstart them in a significant way heading into next year. And it doesn't sound like that's a realistic option, even though there's reports that it is a realistic option.
yeah, I mean, it's December 11th, right? And opening day is March 27th. There is a lot of time between now and when the Blue Jays take the field for the first time in 2025, in games that matter. But this trade is going to be extremely context dependent with what they do the rest of the way.
For sure.
Because
For sure.
if this is it and this is the biggest move that they make is acquiring Andres Gimenez and Nick Sandlin, then it's going to be a long season next year. But if they go out and they make Gimenez their 8-hole hitter or their 9-hole hitter, which he probably will be regardless of what happens, um, then at least you're adding stuff around it. But if you go into next year with him kind of being, he's the guy that they're trying to sell the jerseys for next year,
You're in
then
trouble.
they're in trouble, right? Yeah, and so all of it's going to be dependent on what happens from here. It like you mentioned, there's been the reporting from Sportsnet that maybe there's not much else left for them to add. I know Ben Nicholson Smith said it seems like their spending on the bullpen is completely done with Yimi Garcia today and Nick Sandlin, which again is a little concerning to me because again, is Jimmy Garcia your closer next year
I
now?
think at this point it looks like it, and he's coming off an elbow injury.
He only pitched 9 innings after the Blue Jays traded him.
Yeah, like this is not a guy. He was excellent for the Blue Jays. Let's not kid ourselves. But he was hurt with the Blue Jays, and then he was hurt with the Mariners. This is not a guy that you can rely on to be your, number one relief option. And yeah, you can add during the deadline if your team is good, and you can shuffle the bullpen over time. It's not a hard thing to build a good bullpen, but you got to have the building blocks in place. And Yimi Garcia is a building block, but it's the only building block at this stage. This episode is sponsored by BioSteel. For all your high performance hydration needs, visit biosteel.ca and use promo code Bird's Eye View Podcast at checkout to get 20% off your order. Fuel your performance with BioSteel today. Thank you again to BioSteel for sponsoring today's episode.
Before we get into kind of the Jimmy deal a little bit more, let's talk about Nick Sandlin because yes, he's a part of this trade too. And I mean he's an interesting reliever, right? He's 27. He throws 92, 93, but he's, got the slider, the funky delivery. He's kind of had a good track record of being a solid run preventer, but the of course peripheral stats don't love him. So, you kind of look at it. I mean, his strikeouts kind of jumped last year, which was interesting. Like at least his K per nine, even though his strikeout rate did stay the same from 2023. But he's kind of, a guy who strikes out a large number of hitters or a decent amount of hitters, and I think he's a pretty solid ad for the bullpen. He's a cheap one. He's got all of his options left, so if it doesn't go well, then whatever. But it's a guy that they can toss back there and give it a shot. And but again, like if it is true that this is the last that they're spending on the bullpen, then we'll see. I mean, that's they got some issues behind there if that's going to be the last
Yeah, I
last
mean,
ad.
I appreciate the premise of Nick Sandlin. I don't know if I necessarily am that excited by Nick Sandlin. I saw somewhere on Twitter that his splitter is another pitch that he's made really effective over the last year, and the year before that he threw the slider a lot. He kind of his slider usage actually went down a little bit this year. He's got some tools, and I think also the slide or excuse me the splitter thing is compelling because the Jays have had a lot of guys in recent years. I mean, Gosman's the big one, but guys that have had the splitter really developed nicely with the team. And I don't know if that necessarily means anything. Of course, it's been a really trendy pitch over the last couple of years. So that, of course, is part of the reason why it's exploded so much over the last couple of years, regardless for the Blue Jays. He seems like a nice throw in piece, and he's got all kinds of team control. That's really where his value is, because as far as, his talent as a bullpen piece, expectations for him, maybe he's an effective sixth inning guy.
It's
Maybe.
It's funny to me because he seems to me like he was Cleveland's Genesis Cabrera last season because he threw, almost 60 innings, had a sub 4 ERA, struck out a fair amount of guys, but he had a negative F4 because, he has a little bit of a home run problem and walks too many guys. So, again, it's reliever war. Don't love it. Don't love looking at it, but it is kind of funny to me that he has like kind of the if you covered the names on their stats, you could almost like replicate Genesis Cabrera and Nick
Yeah.
Sandlin
To be fair, they need a new Genesis Cabrera because their Genesis Cabrera is currently with the New York Mets, right?
on a
So
minor league deal.
on a minor league deal. So like they needed a Genesis Cabrera. It's not particularly sexy to be like, we're running it back with last year's bullpen by bringing in a new Genesis Cabrera.
They are really running it back
They
with
are
last
literally
year's
running it
bullpen
back with
because
last year. Well,
because
let's
Jimmy
let's talk.
Garcia
Let's
is back.
yeah, let's talk a little bit of Jimmy more. I mean, we did discuss him, but just like the vibe, I guess. Like your thoughts on the deal. I mean, I'm pretty happy with it.
I think if there was one guy that they traded away that I think would have that made sense the most for them to bring back, it was Jimmy.
for sure.
Obviously, the physical will be important because he did only throw 9 innings for the Mariners before being shut down with an elbow injury, and of course had the elbow injury with the Blue Jays leading into the trade deadline. But he was so good last year, and his stuff is electric, and he kind of went from being a guy that I think Blue Jays fans were a little scared of to being this fireman that they put in any and every situation early in the season last year, and I don't know if he's going to come back and be their closer, or if they're planning to put him back into that same role. But he's got great stuff. He obviously didn't cost them as much as like a Tanner Scott or a Jeff Hoffman or Carlos Estevez would have. So it's a nice little deal. I think 2 years, 15 million. It's not a bunch. It's basically like if you gave Jordan Romano a 2-year deal based on his ARB number, and I think Yimi Garcia is probably a little bit safer than Jordan Romano was, even if Jordan Romano has a touch more upside.
For sure. And like it's the same thing with the elbow. There's a lot of, you can draw a line from A to B in terms of Romano goes to the Phillies, and all of a sudden, Jays suddenly have some flexibility with their cash. And this is probably a comparable deal to what would have been offered to Jordan Romano leading up to him signing elsewhere, right? So, I mean, again, like I said, I like the deal. I think that there's upside to be had. I just think that, again, there's so much of this offseason and so much of today's, news is context dependent by the next 2.5 months.
Yeah. What do you think like as a role for Jimmy? If you look at the Toronto Blue Jays bullpen right now, and let's say their seven or eight relievers are Jimmy Garcia, Chad Green, Eric Swanson, Brendan Little, Nick Sandlin, Ryan
Zach Pop might
Burr,
be in there.
and
It's
Brandon Isert. What role do you think is best for Jimmy Garcia?
You don't have a choice. He's your closer. Who else is in there?
I
It's
mean,
like
Chad Green,
Chad
he was their
Green.
closer last year.
I guess you're going Chad Green's your closer, and then Jimmy's your set. He's a high leverage arm, and he deserves to be a high leverage arm, but he can't be. Last year Jimmy Garcia didn't come into the season as their number one leverage arm. He came in as like their fourth or fifth arm, and I get that contextually he had a much stronger season last year, and he's developed to a certain degree into a high leverage arm. But you cannot go into the season with one, maybe two, if you believe in Chad Green. And I'm not sure how in on Chad Green I personally am. You can't go in without it being year 1, 2 and hope to be a playoff team. You're going to need to go out and invest in the bullpen, but it doesn't sound like they have any, flexibility, contact, or financially. And again, what I was saying before, just the context of these two additions are going to be deeply shaped by whether or not they're able to make one or two more ads, particularly substantial ones.
This is kind of out of the scope of like what happened today. But if you and I were to do a Blue Jays reliever war draft for 2025 as to which Blue Jays relievers would rack up the most war or be the most valuable in 2025, Jimmy Garcia right now would be the first pick.
Easily.
Who would you pick second?
Sandlin, maybe. I don't know. Maybe like Brendan Little. He had a decent stretch. Like it's not good when you're tossing those names out there. It's just not.
Yeah, just interesting exercise, I think, to look at it that way. Let's talk a little bit of Spencer Horwitz because I think it's interesting. Obviously, like you said, he was probably one of the guys with the more trade value of guys that they were willing to trade this offseason. And obviously, he's an older prospect who had an excellent season, but maybe played a little bit above his head for a little bit to begin his run back with the Blue Jays in 2024. So, what do you make of them deciding to ship him out in this deal? And I mean, if you were them, like, do you think that there's a way that you would have done this deal with a Will Wagner instead, or do you think that Horwitz was probably the guy that was needed to get it done?
I don't know if Horwitz is necessarily the guy that needed to be included to get it done per se. Obviously, in my offseason for the Blue Jays, I had him going, but I had him going to Milwaukee for Devin Williams, which tells you where I was kind of valuing the need to add. It was the bullpen. It was not a second baseman. So again, it goes to the same thing where, I think that Horwitz didn't have a spot on this team. And I know that obviously he was their second best hitter last year by WRC plus, but it's just a matter of fact that he doesn't have the chops for second base. First base is Vladimir Guerrero Jr.'s until otherwise proven. And he's not a good enough hitter to be a DH. Ideally, you're going out and you're finding a hitter like a Jock Peterson to be your DH moving forward. Or maybe you're going out and you're adding, I don't know, maybe you're adding your Jurickson Profar, right? You're adding a little bit more of a compelling piece to be your everyday DH. Horwitz had a breakout year this year. He's also older than Gimenez and didn't have this kind of pedigree coming up. Obviously, he showed talent coming up the minors. There's a reason he kept advancing, but it was never with this kind of power and stuff, right? Like he really flashed his power for the first time in his pro career. So he was a guy that it felt like was going to be moved. And it made sense that he was going to be the one that was going to be moved. I'm surprised that it was in this deal because it was kind of like a redundancy thing. But he was clearly the guy that they were going to be looking to sell high on. And I agree with the decision to trade him. Again, I just don't really get this set of circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that he's older than Gimenez. I mean, that, just kind of does show where he was at as a prospect. I think he's a really great story, right? Like I think he was a 24th round pick who had to earn his way to the majors and he did that. Not a lot of guys drafted, not a lot of guys are hanging around anymore that were 20th or later round picks.
I mean,
But
he's drafted in a round that doesn't exist anymore.
yeah, exactly. And so he obviously, great story, worked his way up. Developmental success by the Blue Jays, which they haven't had very many of. So graduating him is big. And I agree. Like it does make sense to trade him, but you figure like if you're trading a guy like that, it's to kind of clear up one area of your roster where you're set and to address an area where you're not set. And it seems like they didn't do that because, now Gimenez is the second baseman, and Will Wagner, Leo Gimenez, Orelvis Martinez are the guys that are going to be, scrapping and clawing for playing time behind him. But there's not going to be a lot of innings to be had at second base. So, what are your thoughts on? I think Wagner might be one of the bigger losers of this trade.
Yeah, I mean, where is he playing? And I don't know how defensively second base was going to be as far as a home. Obviously, he was more talented at the position than Horwitz. He showed a little bit more aptitude, but certainly wasn't anything particularly enticing. So again, maybe it's just a case of the Blue Jays really valuing defense to I mean, arguably to a detrimental degree. But it just he didn't really fit the mold, I guess. And now he's looking at maybe a Kevin Biggio role. Maybe he slides over to play some third base. It's just I'm both fascinated and horrified to see how the infield shakes down over the next couple months because you've got a hammerlock at three of the positions. Ernie Clement probably did enough to earn starting at third base, and that's a really good defensive infield, but it's not that exciting of an infield on the whole.
Man, you know what would have been insane if they had traded for Andres Gimenez, lined up Ernie Clement as your third baseman, and then you sign Max Fried, one of the second or third highest ground ball rate pitcher in baseball.
Like that's what would have made way more sense. It's you need this additional body that's gonna be an impact player, and they don't have that right now.
Yeah, I think there were whispers in the Teoscar Lourdes Varsho trade offseason that they made those moves because they thought they had something else lined up, and then that other stuff kind of fell through. Do you remember these whispers?
I don't totally remember it. I have maybe some recollection, but not a ton. I mean, it was again, it was the same thing where it was kind of like there's more coming, right? And it never came down the pipe.
Yeah, I mean, last offseason, kind of the same thing, right? Like where they sign IKF and Justin Turner, and obviously Justin Turner was the final piece, and it wasn't exactly that encouraging, but obviously they do have the they're under pressure to kind of do something bigger now. And I it seems like the financial stuff, we'll see what happens with that, but the pressure's there to do a Burns, a Santander, a Teoscar, and if not, I really don't see the pathway to this being a playoff team with
No,
the way that they're
totally,
constructed.
totally agree. And I don't get why this competitive balancing, I do get why the competitive balancing is a factor. But I think for this last year of Vladdy and Bo, with a good chance that both walk out the door, I don't know how you can possibly limit yourself when you're stagnant.
Yeah, that's the one thing too that I am a little curious about. Like, obviously the quotes have been there, like the reeks of desperation stuff and that, but it seems like they are kind of who they always have been in the front office so far, that they're kind of sticking to their valuations. Obviously, Sportsnet reported that they didn't go above 700 million for Juan Soto, and that they were far behind in the Max Fried bidding, right? And it seems to me like if they want to, one, compete in 2025, and two, probably save their jobs, they're going to have to go above and beyond to sign somebody, right? Like Corbin Burns, like you're probably going to have to be looking at like 230, 240 if you really want to land him, because again, that's a guy who at least gives you a top of the rotation starter. He lines up probably nicely with the Gimenez acquisition. And then you can, even if you have to overpay him, it gives you a better shot at competing next season than not signing somebody like that would.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not ideal either because it's a pitcher or not a hitter, and they still need the hitting,
Yeah.
right? So it's you're kind of scrambling now.
Yeah, I do wonder, like, if you look at Anthony Santander, like, if you look at the contract and what he's going to get, obviously the last 2 to 3 years of that are going to scare you. But I hate to say this when you're looking at it right now with what's going on with George Springer, but you almost have to, I think, just kind of put that out of your mind and worry about what he's going to give you in 2025, and if it's what you need to be competitive and take a better shot at the postseason, then I think you gotta not worry about those seasons as much as as you would otherwise if you had that security or that longer term vision. Because, again, if Vlad and Bo walk out the door next offseason, how good Anthony Santander is in 3 years is going to be very irrelevant.
You know what this is kind of feeling like? I don't know if this is if you have any recollection of this, but the Baltimore Orioles in I believe 2016 had Chris Davis walk to free agency, and they went out and they gave him a fat contract that everyone knew was going to suck. And they kind of bit the bullet. And I think in 2016 they were competitive, and I think in 2017 they were competitive. Maybe they fell off a little bit, and I mean, for sure by 2018 they were a dumpster fire. And it kind of feels like the Blue Jays are in that boat right now. It kind of feels like that's where they're headed.
Well, they didn't get any favors for their future through the draft lottery on Tuesday.
Yeah, no, that
Uh,
was about as bad. We thought we had it bad when we simulated. Little did
and
we
they got
know.
to seventh. Yeah.
Little did we know.
Before we get to the draft lottery, I do want to hit on Nick Mitchell before we totally move on, because again, he's a guy who they drafted in the fourth round last year. He was a compensation draft pick for them out of Indiana. It surprises me when teams trade guys that they just drafted like 6 months later, kind of thing, and especially a guy like Mitchell who kind of had such a Blue Jays profile. He walked more than he struck out in college. He's a great OBP guy, gets on base a ton. He only hit 5 homers in his spring season for Indiana, but once he got to Dunedin, he hit 4 home runs in 22 games in low A. So again, you like to see your college bats perform, and it's not probably the most difficult thing for college guys to step into low A and perform that well, especially guys coming from a Big Ten school like Indiana or a school in the SEC or anything like that. But I think, seeing a guy like that who succeeded in his pro debut to be gone, especially, who you used one of your first 5 picks on, I think was a little surprising, especially because he's so young. Like I believe he just turned 21 in September. And He's a very Guardians-y player. He's seems like a prototypical Guardian bat to ball kind of thing there. But yeah, I think when you look at the trade, I was a little surprised to see that he was thrown in.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to be the biggest Nick Mitchell psychic or anything, a savant of sorts. But again, I think I agree with your point that it's really surprising to use a top five pick on the guy and then to ship him off 6 months later. I think that's the most surprising element of his inclusion per se. Again, I think that with any draft pick, right? It's really a crapshoot if they even make it to the show. They make it to the high minors, right?
Yeah,
So it's a guy that obviously the Guardians identified and they liked and all the talk, of course. He's a very Guardiansy player, so no surprise he's a guy that they targeted per se. I guess if I had one thing to say, I guess I wish they'd have been able to hold on to him. I mean, of course, you want a prospect hug. I have a hard time really being too pressed about his inclusion, though.
that is fair. The Guardians, interestingly enough, they turned around and they traded Spencer Horwitz to the Pirates for Luis Ortiz, Michael Kennedy, excuse me, and Josh Hartle. And Josh Hartle was picked in the third round of the 2024 draft.
So
So
just adding a
so
little bit,
Cleveland
just
totally locked in on the 24 draft.
they clearly had their guys, they clearly identified them, and they clearly felt that they missed out on
They
them in
they
June and or July, and they were like, let's fix that.
Yes. Um, yeah, draft lottery stuff. I mean, it kind of sucks that the Colton Cowser flips over the Blue Jays thing, and then 5 seconds later your phone buzzes and you look
Yep.
at it and it's Max Fried going to the
Yeah, it
Yankees
was a
after reports were
disaster.
that the Blue Jays were in the finalists there. And I can't believe, I mean, when you
Uh,
look at it, I think the Mariners had like the third worst odds and they moved up into the top five. The Cardinals, after the season that they just had, they moved up into I think they moved up into get the fifth pick. And if you're the Rockies or the Marlins,
you're
you're just throwing
just,
your hands up
of
because you're
course,
dropping out of that number one. It seems like the draft, like it usually feels like professional sports draft lotteries like kind of play out as they're supposed to, but the MLB one really just hasn't so far in 3 years of it, and I'm sure that'll kind of stabilize going forward. But for last
chaos. There's
year,
a
the
lot of chaos.
the
There's been a lot
Guardians
of
to get the first
chaos.
pick with the 2% odds, and for this year the Mariners to move up, and the Nationals. I mean, man, dude, the Nationals, like they've had they'll have had three first overall picks in franchise history now, and obviously the first one was Steven Strasburg, the second one was Bryce Harper, and now you get to go after a Jace Laviolette or an Ethan Holiday, and that's pretty good for them there.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. And they've already got Dylan Cruz waiting in the pipeline. I think he's MLB Pipeline's top prospect. Like, that's a team that's going to be really,
James
really good.
James Woods, CJ Abrams, they're putting the pieces together.
It's going to be a good squad. I mean, I'm sure just like you or I was not pleased when number 8 flipped over. I mean, I hear it coming up. I go, not the Jays, not the Jays, not the Jays. And, the stream was quickly turned off right after that. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the Freed news, just a cacophony of catastrophes in the span of about 5 minutes for the Blue Jays. There'll be options to pick up some guys. I mean, MLB Pipeline again released a mock draft. They had Xavier Nayans, I believe is his name, one of the Jays, a third baseman. Like, there's gonna be options. There's gonna be players. There's gonna be talent. It's MLB draft. There's always guys in the first round that are talented. You might not get the best player, but based on the sport itself, you don't necessarily need the best player. You need a lot of good ones. And the Jays will have an opportunity to add another talented bat, presumably, because they've got lots of pitching. They don't have a lot of hitting to their awfully shallow farm system.
Yeah, it is too bad because you go from adding like one of those guys that I mentioned before who are like the crown jewel automatic like top 20 type prospects, and now you go into, it'll probably be the Blue Jays top prospect at this time next year, but it's not like the slam dunk kind of guy that's gonna be, an MVP type.
No, you're not getting that at the 8. And if you are, you've lucked into something incredible.
Yes, for sure. All right. Well, I think we've kind of hit all the points. You got any other Gimenez thoughts, any Sandlin thoughts, any Garcia thoughts, any just general thoughts around what was a heck of a Tuesday at the winter meetings?
More days like this, please. More days of moves and excitement and things, please. Less sitting around and missing out on Juan Soto. More making trades and signing dudes and doing cool things.
Yeah, on the bright side, at least the Blue Jays gave us something to talk about today. I there aren't a lot of teams that had a lot to talk or have had a lot to talk about throughout the winter meetings. I mean, obviously, Fried is kind of the big move. Trading for Jake Berger. I don't think Rangers fans are staying up until 2 a.m. to record podcasts about Jake Berger. So
Uh,
big day, big day.
Big day in Blue Jays land.
All right. Well, we will be back, of course, probably at the end of the winter meetings, or maybe if anything else comes down tomorrow, we'll see. It seems like maybe the Blue Jays have earned themselves a day of rest, a day of relaxation, a day of drafting somebody in the Rule 5, maybe, perhaps would
Maybe.
be fun. But yeah, we'll be back eventually to kind of keep on discussing this offseason and as all the developments come down. But we're going to run for now. Make sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons if you're watching on YouTube. You can find us there at the Bird's Eye View Pod. If you're listening along on the podcast provider of your choice, make sure to drop a follow and review. You can follow us all on Twitter. I am at Worden_Zach. Jori is at Jori Negin-Shecter. And the pod is at BEV_pod. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.